The Genocide Against the Kurds, a comprehensive academic analysis. This paper examines the historical, political, and structural dynamics that contributed to the genocide against the Kurdish population in Iraq during the late 20th century, with particular emphasis on the Unveiling campaign of 1988. Drawing on established scholarship in genocide studies, political science, and human rights law, the study situates the Kurdish experience within the broader context of state building, ethnic conflict, and authoritarian governance in the Middle East. The analysis explores patterns of discrimination, forced displacement, village destruction, chemical weapons deployment, and mass executions as components of a coordinated state policy aimed at the physical and cultural destruction of the Kurdish population. Although the primary focus lies on events in Iraq, the paper also acknowledges the transnational Kurdish question and the broader regional dynamics that shaped Kurdish vulnerability. The study concludes by evaluating the evidence under internationally recognized definitions of genocide, assessing post-genocide transitional justice mechanisms, and identifying ongoing issues that continue to affect Kurdish communities across the region. The Kurdish people constitute one of the largest stateless ethnic groups in the world, numbering between 30 and 40 million individuals dispersed primarily across Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. Despite their deep historical roots in the region often referred to as Kurdistan, they have consistently lacked an internationally recognized sovereign state. This absence of political sovereignty, combined with the geopolitical interests of regional powers, has made the Kurds particularly vulnerable to systematic discrimination, assimilation policies, and episodes of mass violence. Among these episodes, the Iraqi Unveiling campaign 1988 stands out as the most thoroughly documented and widely studied case of mass atrocities committed against the Kurdish population. Scholars and human rights organizations have classified the Unveiling not simply as a counterinsurgency operation, but as a coordinated state project that meets the criteria for genocide under the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This classification is based on extensive archival evidence, survivor testimony, forensic data, and judicial findings. The purpose of this article is to provide a comprehensive academic analysis of the genocide against the Kurds, structured according to established norms of scholarly writing. The tone is deliberately neutral, avoiding political rhetoric, and focusing instead on empirical evidence and conceptual clarity. The research examines the historical background of Kurdish marginalization, outlines the institutional mechanisms of repression, analyzes the dynamics of the Unveiling campaign, and explores the broader implications for genocide studies and international human rights law. Historical background: the Kurdish question in the modern Middle East. The modern Kurdish question emerged in the aftermath of World War I, when the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire led to a new regional map shaped by the Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, and the Treaty of Lausanne, 1923. Whereas the former treaty had provided for the possibility of an autonomous or independent Kurdish state, the latter omitted such provisions entirely. As a result, Kurdish populated territories were incorporated into the newly established states of Turkey, Iraq, under British mandate, Syria, under French mandate, and Iran. Each of these states adopted nation-building strategies that prioritized linguistic, cultural, or ideological homogeneity, often at the expense of ethnic minorities. The Kurds, having distinct linguistic and cultural identities, became targets of assimilation policies, military repression, or political exclusion depending on the country in which they resided. The Iraqi state and Kurdish resistance. Iraq's relationship with its Kurdish population was defined by cycles of rebellion, negotiation, military confrontation, and repression. These tensions were exacerbated by several factors. The geographical concentration of Kurds in northern Iraq, the presence of oil resources in Kurdish-majority areas, the ambitions of successive Iraqi regimes to consolidate centralized authority, the role of Kurdish political and armed movements seeking autonomy or independence. By the time the Ba'ath Party consolidated control in the late 1960s, the Iraqi state had already engaged in multiple military campaigns against Kurdish insurgents. The Ba'athist ideology, with its emphasis on Arab nationalism and centralized authority, created further distance between Baghdad and the Kurdish population. In the 1970s, policies such as Arabization aimed to alter the demographic composition of resource-rich Kurdish areas, particularly around Kirkuk. Pre-Anfal patterns of repression. Prior to the 1988 Anfal campaign, Iraqi Kurds had already experienced significant violations of fundamental human rights. These included forced displacement and village evacuations, destruction of agricultural land, systematic discrimination, summary executions of suspected dissidents, deportations, particularly of the Faili Kurds, restriction of linguistic and cultural rights. These measures created structural conditions that made escalated violence possible and even predictable. Scholars of genocide have noted that mass atrocities rarely occur without earlier forms of targeted repression that normalize the dehumanization of the victim group and strengthen state mechanisms of social control. State policies and mechanisms of oppression, administrative and legal structures. Iraq under Saddam Hussein employed an extensive security apparatus that included intelligence services, paramilitary units, and specialized military divisions. Laws regulating nationality, internal movement, and property ownership were manipulated to limit Kurdish autonomy and to exert control over Kurdish regions. Kurdish villages deemed illegal or disloyal were often denied government services, infrastructure, or humanitarian assistance. Demographic engineering. Demographic engineering was a central pillar of Iraqi policy. Arab populations were encouraged, sometimes coerced, to relocate to Kurdish-majority areas, especially around strategic oil cities. Kurds, meanwhile, were forcibly relocated to collective towns, mujama'at, urban settlements that hindered independent agricultural livelihoods and facilitated state surveillance. Counterinsurgency as a pretext. Although the Iraqi government often portrayed its actions as counterinsurgency operations targeting armed Kurdish movements, the scope and nature of many measures clearly extended beyond legitimate military objectives. Entire families and communities with no demonstrable ties to armed resistance were subjected to displacement, imprisonment, or execution. This blurring of insurgent and civilian categories laid the groundwork for the mass violence that would later characterize the Anfal campaign. The Anfal Genocide Overview. The Anfal campaign, conducted between February and September 1988, constituted a series of coordinated military and administrative operations aimed at depopulating rural Kurdish regions in northern Iraq. It unfolded across 8 officially designated stages, each involving military assaults, mass executions, village destruction, and forced displacement. Iraqi government documents recovered after 1991 have provided detailed evidence of planning, logistical coordination, and intent. Military structure and strategy. Anfal operations were overseen by the Iraqi Army, the Republican Guard, and specialized units under the command of Ali Hassan al-Majid, later known as Chemical Ali. The strategy combined conventional military assaults with heavy artillery, aerial bombardment, helicopter, gunships, ground incursions, chemical weapons strikes. The objective was not only to defeat Kurdish armed groups but to eliminate the civilian support base by emptying entire regions of their inhabitants. Targeting of civilians. Consistent evidence indicates that Kurdish civilians, particularly men and boys of military age, were systematically detained, separated from their families, and executed. Women, children, and the elderly were also targeted through forced displacement, denial of humanitarian assistance, and exposure to chemical agents. Many were transported to detention camps, where poor conditions, disease, and starvation claimed numerous lives. Gas attacks and environmental impact. Chemical attacks, including those at Halabja and dozens of other rural areas, involved the use of nerve agents, mustard gas, and other internationally prohibited substances. These attacks not only caused immediate casualties but resulted in long-term environmental contamination, chronic illnesses, and genetic disorders in affected populations. Village destruction. An estimated 4,000 Kurdish villages were destroyed during Anfal and related operations. Buildings, crops, livestock, and water sources were systematically targeted. Village destruction served several purposes. To remove a potential refuge for insurgents, to break community cohesion, to eliminate traditional Kurdish rural life, to facilitate demographic restructuring. A large portion of the depopulated areas was later designated as military zones or granted to Arab settlers. Chemical weapons deployment. Types of chemical agents. Investigative reports have identified several chemical agents used during the Anvil campaign, including mustard gas, sulfur mustard, tabun sarin VX, suspected in some areas. These agents caused widespread fatalities, blindness, disfigurement, respiratory damage, and severe long-term health complications. Halabja as a case study. The Halabja attack on March 16, 1988, remains the largest documented chemical weapons assault on a civilian population. The estimated death toll ranges from 3,200 to 5,000 individuals. Although widely recognized as a distinct atrocity, Halabja is part of a broader framework of chemical assaults during the Anvil period. Long-term health consequences. Multiple studies have documented increased rates of cancer, infertility, birth defects, pulmonary disorders. These consequences span generations, underscoring the long-term destructive impact of chemical weapons on Kurdish communities. Forced displacement and village destruction. Majamiat, collective towns. The Iraqi government relocated hundreds of thousands of Kurds to collective towns designed to restrict movement and facilitate state surveillance. Residents often lived under harsh conditions, with limited access to employment, healthcare, or basic services. Destruction of rural economy. The destruction of villages resulted in the collapse of traditional Kurdish economic structures based on agriculture and animal husbandry. This contributed to long-term poverty and dependency. Mass deportations. Entire families, including children and the elderly, were deported to detention camps in southern Iraq. Many detainees never returned, and numerous mass graves have since been uncovered. Demographic and cultural erasure. Arabization policies. Arabization programs targeted key regions, including Kirkuk and Sinjar, altering the demographic balance in favor of populations aligned with the regime. Suppression of language and culture. Restrictions included bans on Kurdish language education, limitations on cultural institutions, and surveillance of Kurdish intellectuals. Destruction of social fabric. Through forced displacement, destruction of villages, and systematic repression, Kurdish social cohesion and intergenerational continuity were profoundly disrupted. Legal classification as genocide. The Genocide Convention. Under the 1948 Genocide Convention, genocide involves intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Evidence of intent. Iraqi government documents and statements by officials demonstrate clear intent to eliminate Kurdish populations in targeted areas. The systematic nature of executions, chemical attacks, and village destruction further supports this interpretation. Judicial findings. Iraqi courts, as well as international tribunals and scholars, have recognized the Anvil campaign as genocide. The legal classification is supported by extensive forensic, testimonial, and documentary evidence. International response and failures. Global political context. During the 1980s, geopolitical alliances, particularly those involving the Iran-Iraq War, limited international willingness to confront the Iraqi regime. Lack of timely intervention. Despite evidence of mass atrocities, major global powers were slow to act, partly due to strategic considerations and partly due to limited visibility of crimes occurring in remote rural regions. Post-1991 engagement. International involvement increased after the Gulf War, leading to limited protective measures for Kurds in northern Iraq, including the establishment of no-fly zones. However, these measures came only after widespread harm had occurred. Post-genocide realities and transitional justice trials and accountability. While some Iraqi officials were tried and convicted, many perpetrators escaped justice. Transitional justice mechanisms have had limited reach. Reconstruction challenges. Rebuilding villages, restoring agricultural lands, and providing psychological support remain ongoing challenges. Memory and documentation. Efforts to document the genocide continue through museums, research centers, and academic institutions. Ongoing human rights issues. Regional instability. Kurdish populations in Turkey, Syria, and Iran continue to face varying degrees of discrimination, conflict, and political repression. Internal displacement. Many Kurds remain internally displaced due to past atrocities or current conflicts involving ISIS and regional powers. Lack of international recognition. Not all states formally recognize the Kurdish genocide, limiting opportunities for comprehensive reparations. The genocide against the Kurds, particularly during the Anfal campaign, represents one of the most documented cases of state-directed mass violence in the late 20th century. The evidence undeniably demonstrates a coordinated effort to destroy a substantial portion of the Kurdish population in Iraq through chemical attacks, mass executions, forced displacement, and large-scale village destruction. The Kurdish case provides essential insights into the mechanisms by which authoritarian states can deploy administrative, military, and ideological tools to carry out genocidal objectives. Despite some progress in transitional justice and recognition, significant gaps remain in accountability, reparations, rehabilitation, and international acknowledgement. For genocide scholars, policymakers, and human rights advocates, the Kurdish experience serves as a critical case study for understanding the dynamics of mass atrocity and the challenges of post-genocide reconstruction.